Hi there! In this After Effects tutorial, we are going to recreate one of the amazing scenes that we can see in the Vane motion reels. Here's an example of what we are going to do.
Wealth makers are the ones to be inside the game. Wealth makers are the ones to be inside the game.
By the way, if you want to support the channel, in addition to your likes, you can also do it from my Patreon page. There, I share with you all the projects I use in the tutorials, so you can keep practicing and learning. I leave the link in the description if you want to take a look. Oh, another thing. The other day I posted this reel on Instagram.
Life is not a speed race, but a marathon where endurance is worth more than haste. Don't run to arrive first. Walk with purpose, enjoy each landscape and learn from each step. In the end, it is not whoever arrives faster who wins, but whoever treasures the most moments along the way.
Many of you have asked me for the tutorial. I wasn't planning to do it because it would take about 3 or 4 hours, and I don't want to bore you too much. But if you give a lot of likes to this video, or I see that you leave many comments about it, I will probably explain you step by step the whole process. As in other tutorials, the first thing I'm going to do is to import the files. In this case, it is a 3D model of a Bitcoin coin. I'm also going to create a new composition called Main with a resolution of 1920 by 1080 in horizontal format. If you want to make this animation for a reel, simply invert these dimensions, and that's it. At 30 frames per second and with a duration of 10 seconds, it is sufficient. To this composition, I'm going to bring the 3D model. I'm going to adjust it to the size of the composition, and I'm going to hit OK. With Ctrl plus Alt plus Home, I will center the anchor point. And with Ctrl plus Home, I'm going to center it on view. I'm going to set the scale to 80%. Now, with right-click, I'm going to create a 35mm camera and a node. Okay, again, right-click, New Null Object. I'm going to convert it to 3D as well, and I'm going to link the camera to this object. By the way, if you like documentary-style editing, my course is now available. But it's not just a course in which I show you how to animate a sequence in After Effects, and that's it. But I show you the entire procedure that I followed to create this animation. From the initial idea to the final render, going through each and every phase of the creative process. I'll leave the link in the description in case you want to take a look. At the beginning of the timeline, I'm going to do the first animation. I'm going to display the position and mark a keyframe. I'll activate 2 views to better see what's going on. On the Z-axis, I'll move the camera away from the 3D model, setting a value of -1300. Now, from this point, I'll move to frame number 17 and zoom the camera to a value of 300. As I say in other occasions, I choose these values and times because, after several tests, they are the ones that have worked best for me. I will smooth these 2 keyframes with F9, and in the graphics editor, I will shape the curve. If you don't see it like this, you should activate Edit Speed Graph. Then, I'll move these 2 handles to the left of the curve. Let's move on. Now I'm going to go to frame 5, and at this same null, I'm going to display the rotation, and in Y, I'm going to mark a keyframe. And from this point, I'm going to move to second 104. Here, I'm going to put a value of 180 degrees on the Y-axis. I'll also smooth these 2 keyframes with F9. Right-click, Keyframe Velocity, and I'll set the influence to 70%. Okay, that's perfect. While I'm at it, I'm going to do a little animation on the coin as well. I'm going to spread out the rotation. And on the x-axis, I'm going to put a value of negative 20 degrees so that it's a little bit diagonal. Just below this keyframe, at frame 17, I'll mark a keyframe in the orientation. And here at the beginning, I'll modify these axes until I find a position that I like. More or less around there. These two keyframes, I'll also smooth them with F9. Okay, perfect. Now, in this last keyframe with the text tool, I'll type subscribe. I'll also convert this text to 3D, center its anchor point, and center it in view. Then, I'll right-click on the layer, select Transform, and flip it horizontally so it's in the right position. I'll change the font on this text to Helvetica. I will create a solid that will serve as a background to better visualize all the elements of the composition. As for the color, I'll put an intermediate color between black and white. With a right-click, I will convert this solid into a guide layer so that it will only be visible in this composition. Now, I'll also make a small animation for this text so that it won't be seen in this part. I'll add the opacity property and set it to 0. Then, in the range selector, I'll set a keyframe to start. And a bit further on, I'll set it back to 100. The only thing I have to do now is to adjust the timing. Here you can still see the text. But just at this point, when it is no longer visible, I will set 2 keyframes. I'll go back to the beginning of the timeline. And again with the text tool, I'm going to write "give me like." I'll also convert this text to 3D, center its anchor point, and adjust it in view. The font I'm going to use is Dharma, although you can use any font you like. I want this text to be behind the coin. To do this, I'll activate 2 views, and on the Z-axis, I'll move it to the background. Look, there is the text just above the coin. Here you can see it more clearly. Still, I'll move it a bit further back. P key, and on the Z-axis, I'm going to put a value of 1200. But I'm also going to make it much bigger. About there. Well, maybe less. Let's see. That way, I like it better. Now, this text should not be seen again in this part, where it enters the scene again. Right here at this point, when it's no longer visible in the composition, I'm going to cut the layer there. Come on, let's go on. I'm going to stand on this last keyframe, and I'm going to duplicate this null again to make another move. U key. I'm going to delete it and I'm going to mark a keyframe in position and another one in X rotation. This animation will start at frame 22, so I'm going to place these two keyframes there. I'm going to match the previous null to the new one, and I'm going to move to the second one 12. Now, here in the X rotation, I'll put a value of -110 to make it completely horizontal. The exact value is 90 degrees, but you have to add the 20 degrees that we rotated the coin before. So, -90 plus -20 makes a total of -110. On the Z-axis, I'll also move it up a bit, giving it the same value, 110. I'll smooth all these keyframes with F9 and give the handles an influence of between 70% and 75%. It doesn't need to be exact either, more or less around there. I'm going to do a preview to see what it looks like. Okay, fine. This text, you shouldn't see it on the back. So, about at this point, right there, I'm going to cut the layer, okay? Being in the last few keyframes, I'm going to duplicate this text layer. I'm also going to move it forward a little bit and extend it a little bit more. U key. And I'm going to turn off the animation that we applied earlier to this copy. Now, with Control plus Home, we center the text in view. But to rotate it correctly, I'm going to activate two views. On the X-axis, if this null has a value of -110, here I'll also set it to -110. Notice that it's going to be perfectly oriented to the camera's viewfinder. It looks totally straight. I'm going to make it a little bit smaller, about there. Now, this text, I want to move it up a little bit. But if I move it on the Z-axis, it also moves back a little bit. And it's no longer facing the viewfinder of the camera. Look at that. Well, I'll do Control plus Z to leave it as it was. Now I'm going to activate the local axis option. The difference between world axis mode and local axis is that with world axis mode, all the elements are oriented with respect to a global axis based on the three-dimensional space of the composition, while with the local axis, each element is oriented separately and individually with respect to the global axis. So now look, if I move it on the Y-axis upwards, we can see that it always remains parallel and perfectly adjusted to the camera's viewfinder. Right? So I'm going to leave it more or less in this part. Here I'll type Vane. With Control plus D, I'll duplicate the text, and this copy, I'll move it a little bit to the front, placing it in front of the coin, which is right here. I'll leave it about there, and I'll also move it down a bit. Here I'll write motion. However, these two texts also have to fit the timing. More or less in this part, just like before, so that you don't see the back of the text. Here you can already see the front part, so right at this point, I'll cut the layer. The text I have here, I'll move it a little bit further down, about there, and cut it off at the same point. I'm going to preview it and see what it looks like. Okay, that's fine. I'm going to turn these two texts off for now. Now, with Ctrl+D, I'll duplicate the null again to make one last move. U-key, and I'm going to delete these keyframes. I'll mark a keyframe in the Y rotation, and I'm going to link the previous null to the new one. This animation is going to start at the second 104. And now I'm going to move up to 205. I'm going to set the Y rotation to a value of 0. But notice, there's something going on here. I'm going to turn on the rulers to see it more clearly. I'm going to put one right on the edge of the coin. If we now move the Y rotation, notice it's not rotating correctly. This is because this null is not perfectly centered with the anchor point of the 3D model. But we'll fix that easily. I'm going to delete this null that I've duplicated and make a new copy. U-key. We remove these keyframes. Now, to perfectly center this null with the anchor point of the coin, we are going to press Ctrl plus Shift, and with the pick whip, we are going to link it to the 3D model. With this, we get that the null that we have duplicated acquires all the position properties of the 3D model. Here we can remove the parent link. Now I'm going to mark a keyframe in Y rotation again. And this animation I've said it's going to start at second 104, right there. And let's not forget to match the previous null to the new null. Now, from this point, I'm going to move to second 205. And in Y rotation, I'm going to set it to a value of 0. Notice that it now rotates perfectly. Notice the guideline and the edge of the coin. Okay, as I said, here in Y rotation, I'm going to set it to 0. These two keyframes, I'm also going to smooth them with F9. And in the graphics editor, I'm going to assign these values to the handles. I'm going to double-click, and I'm going to give this one an influence of 40. I'm going to double-click on this one, and I'm going to give it an influence of 60%. Well, we've almost got the camera animation. The only thing is, we're missing one last piece of text in this last movement. So I'm going to turn these two layers back on. This one here, which says motion, I'm going to cut it off just at the point where you see the back. Right there. Now, this one that says Vane, I'm also going to cut it at this point. But I'm not going to delete this layer. Here, I'm going to put tutorials. Right-click, come to transform, and I'll flip it horizontally so that it's in the right position. Okay, now it's done. Now we have the camera animated and each element in its place. But what happens when we have the advanced 3D render engine activated? For example, if we want to activate the motion blur on the text layers, we see that it doesn't work. In fact, if we go to Composition Settings in 3D Renderer, if we have Advanced 3D activated, all this is disabled. Effects, blending modes, layer styles, track matte, masks, motion blur, camera field blur, all this doesn't work with this render engine. So, to add some effects, I'm going to do the following. First of all, I will create a folder to have everything well organized. I'm going to create a new composition called Montage. I'm going to leave everything as it is, and now, the composition called Main. I'm going to duplicate it 3 times. 1, 2, and 3. Copy 2 will be called First Text. Copy 3 will be called Other Texts. And copy 4 will be called Bitcoin. Now, in the assembly composition, we're going to bring all these copies that I just made. I'll put first text at the bottom, Bitcoin at the top, and other text in the middle. With a right click, I'll create a background, quite dark gray. Now, one by one, I'll go into the compositions. In the Bitcoin one, I'll activate the Solo to 3D model icon so that only this layer is visible. In the other texts, I'll keep these 4. I'm going to switch to Classic 3D, and I'm going to activate Motion Blur. Notice, now it's working. Having switched to Classic 3D, we have all the effects enabled again. In the first text, I'll keep only the one that appears at the beginning. I'm also going to switch to Classic 3D and activate Motion Blur. If we now play the montage composition, it should work perfectly, as the camera animation is the same for all 3 compositions. Well, here we still have to make some adjustments, as the Bitcoin is on top of everything. It looks fine here, but in this part, it should be behind the text. We're going to fix this easily, right at this point. When they're a little bit separated, I'll cut the composition and move it underneath. Now it looks perfect. With this, we would have finished the tutorial. If you want, you can still add some more effects, like glows and other details, but that's up to you. If you got stuck in any step or there's something you don't understand, write me in the comments and we'll solve it. If you liked the tutorial, leave me a like to let me know. See you in the next video.